Hello and welcome. My name is Chela Montoya and I'm the Assistant Vice President of Adult Education and Public Programs at LACMA. Welcome to this virtual public program presented in conjunction with Yoshitomo Nara, an exhibition at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art curated by Mika Yoshitake. The exhibition spans over 30 years of the internationally acclaimed artist's practice from 1987 to 2020 through the lens of his longtime passion for music. I am very excited to introduce the final program in this series, Art and Conversation, Yoshitomo Nara. It covers 3 different periods in Nara's career, with this final episode entitled, No Longer Just a Girl with a Knife, Art After Fukushima. It expands on Nara's continually evolving practice to the present day. This series is presented by Yeewan Koon, Chair of the Department of Art History at the University of Hong Kong, and author of Yoshitomo Nara, a recently published monograph on the artist. I personally wanted to extend my deep gratitude to Yeewan for her work on this series. Although we were unable to be in person at the exhibition due to the stay-at-home orders, I am very proud to offer this program in this virtual format with this more in-depth look at the artist's practice and to a global audience. So I wanted to just say thank you to Yeewan for her extensive work on both the monograph and this series. We hope to welcome you back to LACMA soon, and in the meantime, that you will enjoy this series as well as the recently released catalog and Yeewan's recent monograph. I do have my copies here, and I wanted to briefly share a show and tell just so that you can see what these amazing books look like. This right here is the LACMA exhibition catalog, where you can get a sneak peek at the work on view, and it also includes liner notes by the artist on some of his albums in his personal collection. So that's the exhibition catalog. LACMA also produced a special edition catalog, which has a beautiful clamshell box, and it also includes a vinyl LP in yellow, a beautiful record that has original music and covers by the American indie rock band Yo La Tengo, and songs from the 1960s and 70s selected by the artist. And the interior has these beautiful booklets on each of the works in his practice. Finally, the Yeewan Koon's recent book, which is a 300+ page monograph on the artist that looks at work from the last 3 decades. So I hope you will enjoy these resources until we can welcome you back to the museum. Throughout the program, I encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A function. We hope to get to as many of these as we can by the end of the program. So please share also where you are coming from with your question. Yeewan is actually presenting today from Hong Kong, and I am based in Los Angeles. I would now like to formally introduce Yeewan Koon and share her extensive background. Professor Yeewan Koon is the chair of the Department of Art History at the University of Hong Kong. Her research expands a broad area of Qing art and a secondary area in contemporary art in Asia. Her publications include Yoshitomo Nara 2020, which is currently being translated in other languages, a Chinese Canton painting in the local export art in 2018, and Defiant Brush, Su Renshan and the Politics of Painting in 19th Century Guangdong 2014. She is a recipient of several research awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship, American Council of Learned Scholars, and visiting scholarships at Cambridge University and Columbia University. Koon also works in the contemporary art field as a critic and curator. In 2014, she was guest curator of It Begins With Metamorphosis, shooting at the Asia Society Hong Kong Center, and was one of the selected curators of the 12th Gwangju Biennale Imagine Borders in 2018. She is currently working on an international exhibition of Hong Kong art scheduled for June alongside the inaugural Helsinki Biennale. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Professor Yeewan Koon, and I hope you enjoyed this program.
Hi, good morning or good evening, wherever you are in which part of the world. Thank you for coming and sharing and attending this lecture with me as well. It's been a great 3-week series, and I really want to thank Cello and her team for helping me out putting this together. It hasn't always been easy because I'm very much a self-declared Luddite, and I needed quite a bit of technological help, and they were there throughout the whole journey. So thank you very much. I also want to thank Mika Yoshitake, the curator of the show. She shared a lot of her work with me, especially with this particular lecture, and I really want to thank her for also inviting me to take part in this series. I'm going to start sharing my screen with you so we can start with this lecture. So let me just go to the next screen. Just to recap on the whole series, the 3 talks have actually taken us from the very early days when Nara began with perhaps his most famous work, or a seminal work that started his whole process, and in particular his signature style, The Girl with the Knife in Her Hand, that was made in 1991. Last week, I looked at Nara in a larger context of contemporary Japanese art, and in particular the 1990s and 2000s. So today's talk takes Nara to the present times by looking at his more recent works, and in particular the impact of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. Now, what I want to highlight in this particular talk are 2 areas of influences that are seldom discussed when we think about Nara's work. The first is his response to Fukushima and the more anti-nuclear political side of Nara that is discussed less in English language, but there's actually quite an extensive coverage written in Japanese. The second is his return to his northern roots. And with this, we take the story back to Nara's early beginnings, growing up in Hirosaki. I want to stress, however, that these 2 aspects are only part of a greater whole of understanding Nara's paintings of children. Which is that Nara draws on he's trying to seek personal connections, more human connections, that draws on themes of survival and responses of empathy, which I read as the fundamental condition behind his art making, which also goes to explain why he is drawn to those on the margins, whether they're children, refugees, and as we shall see today, those who are part of an indigenous group of people. I think his work from this period is one of his most exciting, partly because there are works that are made by an artist who is now very conscious of becoming older, the passage of time. And I think that has led him to try to leave behind a more meaningful mark. He's thinking about legacies, he's thinking about what to do next in terms of leaving his mark in the art world itself, but also within Japan more generally. Now, what you see here on the screen is not only an older Nara, but it's also the word "Tabiu" on the hat, which is at the back of the girl behind him, which is a very special place for Nara, and one that I will talk about later. I tease about Nara being old. I have come to go to know him well, and he's okay with me calling him that. An important starting point for this particular talk is the Tohoku earthquake and disaster that kind of shook the world on 11th of March, 2011. So the combined force of the earthquake and a tsunami, which then led to the failure of a cooling system at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. And that caused a level 7 nuclear accident that released high quantities of radioactive discharge. The extent of the damage was enormous. More than 450,000 people were left homeless, and the death toll, according to current count, exceeds over 18,000. Just again, a reminder, Tohoku region is in the northeast of Japan, and it's in an area that's very close to Nara's family home. So for Nara, when he saw this happening and after it all happened, as soon as the highways reopened, the first thing he did was to drive up to see his mother, which included passing the borders of Fukushima and many other small villages and towns that were hit by disaster. It was a very bleak journey. So as soon as he arrived, and like so many other people in Japan, he and his mother collected things from the house that were not being used or needed and drove to the smaller towns affected by the disaster. Nara was at this moment in time struggling with his work. As with his experience after Afghanistan, and again, a subject I touched on in the first lecture, he found himself actually struck by this sort of creative inertia, because at that time, that sort of pain and confusion was very, very personal. He found it very difficult to paint, even though he had a very big major solo show that was going to happen in the following year in 2012. At this moment in time, he only painted a handful of paintings. And what we see on the screen are two examples of that. And these were made as smaller paintings that were made specifically to raise money for victims of the disaster. Now, in Missing in Action 2011 painting, the one that's on the right, what we are actually seeing at the bottom of the frame is a very small house. And this small house, it recalls one of Nara's earliest symbols of his childhood. And this was a symbol that we saw right at the very beginning when he first started painting, but which sort of disappears from his earth around 1991, which is again with a girl with a knife in her hand. And then what we see in here, it's return. And I think this is very significant, as it not only brings back this idea of childhood memories, it brings back in particular his childhood memories. And in contrast, in parallel to this, in a symmetrical relationship to this house, what we're seeing is a very small circle of white light, suggestive, I think, of a nuclear mushroom cloud. Caught between these two motifs, what we have in the middle is a much more pensive young girl. And if you can see, and I hope you can see, around her head are these radiating white light, evoking an image of a child affected by nuclear radiation. In contrast, and as a perfect pairing, is Atomcraft Baby, which is a much more direct expression of that sort of explosive energy of a nuclear bomb, with golden lines radiating from a head of an angry young girl. Nara has always depicted these two sides, the slightly angry, perhaps even menacing child, and on the other, the much more pensive and reflective. And it is almost as if we've seen he's using these two girls to represent the complexities of emotions in this very damaged Japan. Now, as I said before, he wasn't very keen to do that much artwork because he didn't find meaning in it at this moment in time. He was invited to take part in an art show in Fukushima, but he didn't feel that that was an appropriate response for him, because then it would be talking about his art rather than what he wanted to do, which was a much more direct engagement of trying to give back in some ways. And so instead he used social media, and he organized a number of very informal talks in the area, inviting high school students to see if they wanted to have sharing sessions. And in particular he shared one which really touched him, which was with the Soma Higashi High School Art Club, which is in Fukushima, where students shared with Nara their stories of struggling through torrential waters, when their house were being flooded, and then when they were actually being drifted and pulled away by the waters, hanging onto the hides of the cows, even as the contents of the homes were sweeping past them in the water. On another occasion, and this is related to what we're seeing on the screen now, he had packed on his trip these giant streamers, and they're giant flags that in the shape of fish. And these were very traditional flags that were used for Children's Day festival in Japan. And what he did was he organized an art workshop during which he and with the art students fabricated costumes made out of these traditional streamers. And he took pictures of these kids, and it was just a fun, playful sort of exercise. And then he gave these photographs to these children and their families who had lost everything, including family photographs and lost memories. Although Nara knew that these photographs can never heal the trauma of disaster, he had hoped that they would come to serve as mementos of happier moments. What really helped him get back to that stage of work again after several months of restlessness was that he went back to school. He returned back to his alma mater, the Aichi University of the Arts, as a visiting artist. And maybe it's because it's the familiar sights, it's the smell of oak campus. It was here in this environment he found he could make art again. But what he did was not painting, nor drawing. What he did instead was take large clumps of clay. And essentially, as he himself describes it, although he couldn't paint pictures on a blank canvas, he found he could actually confront this massive lump of clay. Because what he did was he almost attacked it like a sumo with my body, as he describes it. What I want to show you here is just what I meant by this attacking of the clay. You can see in that close-up how he wanted to leave his physical marks on the surface. There's a real feeling of tactility where he's literally leaving behind traces of his physical contact on the surface. You can feel him, see him pulling at it, dragging his hands across the surface, and sometimes more gently coats in it until this lump of clay turns into a child. And through that long process of attacking this material, he's embedding in that material his anxieties, the anger, the sorrow, and more importantly, that sense of hopelessness that he was actually feeling very strongly at that moment in time. So it was very much both a mental and a physical process, almost as if through that bodily connection with the medium, he was able to reach an emotional catharsis, which reconciled not only the emotional turmoil within himself, but that he was then able to reach a stage where he felt he was making art that had something to say. I mean, you can literally see in this Midnight Pilgrim, especially with the eyelids, how he's pulling at the finger, using his finger to draw out the eyelids, and also with the lips, how he's pressing down into it. And if you look even closer, sometimes you can see even his fingerprints and thumbprints on these particular artworks itself. He's literally leaving a legacy of his body on these works. And just to give you a sense of these works, he made about 12 or 13, I can't quite recall at the top of my head, it's around that figure. And you can see the size of the larger heads itself. They're massive, enormous things. Now, it was after he finished making those heads, he was able to then return to the studio. And what I'm showing here is Miss Spring, the very first painting that he did, that really where everything came together. And I think it is from this moment, and in particular, Miss Spring is so representative of this, where he moves to a new stage of art making. If you look at this painting, what you see are these blobs of round autumn colors in her hair. That, like, you can see the circles of paint as if they're illuminating, floating in her hair. But then you see the patches of green, more jeweled paintings on the body itself. And then if you take a look at the eyes, I don't see the eye. And one of the things that's really striking about the eyes is that each one of them are different. They're completely different in colors, more importantly. Now, I do not see this treatment of eyes as a window of the souls, because that would be almost too cliched as an exercise, but rather there are microcosms of that painterly world in which this child inhabits. It's almost like a reduced form. All the colors that are inside the paintings are inside those eyes. Now, it's very hard to detect what she is thinking. And this opens her inner world up to interpretations that can range from diffidence to defiance. So Nara has been, and I want to say that he has been moving towards seeking a new type of expression for his children or his painted big-headed girls, without really consciously plotting a plan of how to get there. It simply emerged as part of this sort of organic process. And what we have here in this particular artwork is a girl who's motionless in posture, but very lively in textures and colors. And in simplifying that very basic structure of that figure, he has complicated his use of colors. And it is that which gives the girl life. And I just want to go back again very briefly to just talk about these different periods. And I'm using these three representative stages of Nara's development of the painterly girl, because in drawings, it is actually a very different kind of progression. So in the early 90s, 1990s, he was using more the tropes of kawaii. He's using the techniques of drawing, and a girl, and she's always often drawn or painted carrying some sort of prop, in this case of a knife. And she has moved from his early fantastic childhood paintings to that of the child itself. He then moves away from the line, a journey that he struggles with, largely because he wants to experiment with his own craft, but also because he wants to distance himself from that narrow box of being defined as a manga-inspired artist, as he is not one. He's not that simple, as we have seen in last week's lecture. And what he does, he experiments with color textures, but also colors that are difficult. He's using color combinations that are not always easy to work with. However, in this middle period, so as after acid rain, as an example of that, it's never quite almost resolved in that the girl is perhaps sometimes still too kawaii. It still relies on these childlike gestures. So we stay within the framework of the girl with the knife in the hand. It's closer to that work when we situate it in a chain, in this particular chain. But it is a very important step in his transition. Miss Spring is different. The scale of the painting, she's quite big, and her general stillness and simplicity renders her almost like a monument, an icon-like form of a child, not unlike the giant heads that has a sense of watching. And I think his engagement with those large giant clay heads, which he turns into metal, which just to make sure I clarify that. And we see these large clay heads creating a wonderful correlation with his paintings. You can see almost as if they're using very similar technique. If with his clay, he's sort of engaging it by pulling and dragging and adding with the clay. In his paintings, there are layers and layers and layers and layers of colors. What you're seeing here on the screen is, I was very fortunate to be in his studio one time when he was in the middle of a work, an artwork. So this is one of the early stages of a painting that's not yet quite complete. And this is one of the layers in which he's working on. And you can see how he's just, again, lots and lots of dots, lots of brush strokes, lots of lines. These are very, in some ways, the kind of like the very similar sense of trace that we have in the clay that he's working on. He's building on top, he's scraping away, he's building on top, scraping away as well. Oops. Let me just go back. And that detail is from this particular painting, Girl Left Behind the Night. And what you see, I want together side by side is what I mean, and how in many ways the image of the child seems very similar. They're very simple, a very similar type of shape face, a very similar kind of hairstyle, a very similar type of body, a full frontal bust portrait. Very, very different from what we had seen before. And what I mean by that watchful presence, we almost feel as if she is looking at us and intensely looking at us, and we are forced to look back at her, but we feel very uncomfortable with it because at some stage we feel there is a greater sense of her watchful agency. Let's just leave it at that. So very powerful still paintings. But again, if you look closely, and I really urge you, if you get a chance to go to LACMA or if you see his artworks in any other exhibitions, is to stand really close to his paintings, because that's when you can see the many different layers of paint that is embedded beneath that surface. There are not flat paintings in any way. But it wasn't always those girls. It wasn't always those bust figures that we see. He also, at this moment in time, started referring back to his earlier works. He's thinking and reflecting back on his own practice. And in so doing, he recreates works that he had made in the early part of his career. And we see that with Sprout the Ambassador, which was made in 2011, and how he switches and changes that around. A very similar idea of a girl holding two sprout leaves in their hands, but now shifted into a more pensive one, a more pensive child. And he keeps playing around with these dialogue with his earlier work. And it's almost as if he is talking to himself as he is making or remaking his child. Another thing that we start seeing is he goes back to some of these earlier ways of making. And in this case, from the bomb shelter, it's a series of billboard paintings. Now, he had stopped doing a lot of billboard paintings for a while. And so he's coming back to this. And we see from around this period in the mid 2010s, a lot more of these kind of paintings. There are paintings that have direct relationship with drawings. He's essentially copying what he draws in in pen in this case, but sometimes with pencils, and he enlarges it in paintings. And this is something that he's never really done until this particular period in time. Now, for those of you who know or have seen a lot of Nara's work, you may actually recognize the posture of this young girl. It comes again from a very early artwork in 1995, one of his earliest, Abandoned Puppy. And you can see, again, it's this idea of a child reaching out of the box, or in this case, reaching out of the bomb shelter. He's making echoes towards this particular artwork. But this particular artwork from the bomb shelter, which is a set of 4, is actually very important in that he made those drawings while he was watching a film. He was watching, in particular, a 1953 film called Hiroshima, which was directed by Hideo Sekigawa, sorry. And this film, it's based on a best-selling book called Children of the Atom Bomb, which was published in 1951. And it was a collection of 105 first-hand accounts of school children who survived the Hiroshima bombing, compiled by the author Arata Osada. So they're witness accounts, again, thinking about witnessing, thinking about watching, and that watchfulness of children. The background to this film is really interesting. So let me just take a moment to talk about it. So this film was an independent production, and it was funded by the Japanese Teachers Union, JTU, which was made as a corrective to an earlier movie called Children of Hiroshima, which was based on the same book. However, JTU criticized the first film for not sufficiently addressing the political ramifications of the nuclear bomb. And so in this second adaptation, which was much more ambitious in scope, it offered many different perspectives on the bombing. It's harrowing to watch. But one of the things that the director did was he added to add to that authenticity of it being a witnessed account, he also included thousands of nuclear attack survivors as extras in this movie. And the film begins with a classroom scene in which a teacher, ignorant of the legacy of the nuclear bomb and the subsequent discrimination against the victims, the nuclear attack survivors, is schooled by his own students. And then we start seeing an understanding of this teacher's journey and understanding the consequences of what had happened. So you can see how that particular story may resonate so much with what Nara is trying to do at this moment in time, or what he is not necessarily talking about the movie, but what are some of the narrative threads that he finds resonating in that movie with what is going on in 2011 Japan. This is another part of that set, Peace Girl 2019. In some of his works, and we see it in this one, Nara makes reference to the hypocrisy of wartime Japan's right-wing imperial military by drawing attention to its similarity to Nazi Germany. And what we have here, Bad Head, is actually a rather unusual painting by Nara. And it's a wonderful, simple, and powerful painting of a fallen head of Hitler lying on its side in a pool of blood. And it's something that he had explored in drawings many, many years before, but now we actually see him turn it into a billboard painting. Billboard painting in particular is a genre that he associates with public statements. And so we start seeing much more, Nara become much more open about his political position. Perhaps more than anything at this moment in time is the role that his artworks made in a series of protests. So No Newts, which is a very small color, acrylic and color pencil paper drawing, was made way back in 1998. But it was one that came back again in 2012, and it was used quite often for different protests against anti-nuclear, the reopening of the nuclear plant. So there were anti-nuclear protests that was happening at this moment in time. And one of the things that by using this, by using No Newts in these protests, it wasn't just a case of saying Nara's as a celebrity endorsement of the protests, but we also see how how he's supporting what they're doing. And what he did in order to support this was he made his version of this artwork available, a high-res version of this available for download on social media. Another work that was used is Miss Spring. And in particular, and you can see in the screen here, it was used in a massive rally that happened in 2012 at Yoyogi Park in Tokyo, which was a Sayonara nuclear power plants, was part of an anti-nuclear organization and campaign in Japan. And what they were trying to do was actually get 10 million people's petition in order to say goodbye to nuclear power plants in Japan. And this organization held many, many rallies, and this is only one of them. And in this particular one, we can see Nara's Miss Spring being used as a banner at the back. And we can see, along with No Nukes, how this painting, Miss Spring, and No Nukes becomes part of that visual landscape of contemporary anti-nuclear protests in Japan. It is a rather unusual painting, though, in the sense that she's not unlike No Nukes. Miss Spring isn't really doing anything, like she's just standing still there in its monumental presence. But it has next to this particular banner and in this particular context, this idea and reminder of, first of all, of what is the consequences, the long-term consequences of nuclear power plants for the next generation. But she also stands almost in this accusing way, looking down and defiant way of protesting herself in her quiet stance. I want to wrap up this section of Nara, the anti-nuclear stance, with two very unusual paintings. The first, both of these paintings were made for an exhibition that were made in response to an artist, Georgian artist, an outsider artist called Nikol Pirosmani. And what we see is Nara's interpretation of this particular artist. So Pirosmani was a self-taught itinerant artist, and he in particular, for his straightforward honesty, this folk style quirkiness is now regarded, although during his own lifetime, he was perhaps not as popular, but now he's recognized as a pivotal artist of the modern art movement in Slavic Russia. And what Nara is doing, he's capturing the personalities of these two women. We only see an actress Margarita here, but he combines it with his own signature style of that bust portrait, creating this very hybrid mode. But the painting I want to actually look at is this one. In this second portrait, it's a more contemplative image of Queen Tamar. And Queen Tamar is one of the legendary good rulers of Georgia. And in Pirosmani version, she's holding onto a scroll which identify her good rulership. Nara's image is again showing that combination of his big-headed girl with Queen Tamar. But instead, the scroll that he's holding, if you look very closely, actually is are words that reference Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, a clause that outlaws war as a means of settling international disputes. Having taken effect on May 3rd, 1947, after World War II, it was one of those laws that often come up for debates as the more right-wing members of government argues that investment in the military is about strengthening self-defense. Now, we will know exactly what position Nara takes, because if we read the words, part of it reads, and I quote here, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order. The people forever renounce nuclear as a sovereign right, the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. Yoshitomo Nara, 2018. I think that's a very powerful message, and I think it's enough to leave it here at this moment in time. Another important direction after 2011 is that we see Nara increasingly interested in the North and to marginal communities. And this return to North, we can really see in another very important photography project. And this is where he goes to Sakhalin. And Sakhalin is a very remote part of island that's north of Hokkaido. And it is an island that has often been either Russian or Japan. And it has a fragmented history that belongs to both of these powers. Right now, it belongs to Russia. Part of the reason why Sakhalin is so important, it was actually a place where his grandfather once worked as a fisherman. And so this project gave him a chance to trace a part of his heritage as well. I'm just going to flick through some of these images, and you can see one of the things that he's interested, this interest in his return to the North and what that means. This is a picture of an old man. He's playing an accordion on his bed, and you can almost hear him singing. And what he's actually singing is that he's singing an old Japanese folk song. These are some of the images of the houses on the island and the people on the island. And one of the things that this project is representative of is a part of his much larger interest in places at the margins. And that's what we're going to turn to next. And this is Tobiu. This is Tobiu, which is a very remote area in a district in Hokkaido. Now, the first time Nara went there, he went out of curiosity. He went there because he had heard of its arts and music festival, and he just wanted to see what kind of things was going on. But when he got there, he became very interested in being much more engaged in this place. Now, Tobiu today is it's a place that it has no more than 10 families. It has a total population of around 30 people. And like so many places in many rural parts of Japan, was once a thriving place, but now is very much a place where there's very few young children. It's made up of the elderly, as most of the younger generation have moved into cities. Tobiu is also interesting because, like so many places in Hokkaido, it is only known by the Ainu name, and Ainu is the indigenous people of Japan. Now, the Ainu language itself is based on oral tradition, which means it doesn't have a standardized writing system. So many of the site names do not even appear on the maps in the region because the way that they're written, there are no ways of writing their words. They're only actually transmitted orally. When you do write them, they're often written as transliterations, and it can be composed of hiragana or katakana, which means that there are variations in the way that they are written. They're not necessarily in the pronunciation. Tobiu, for example, can be written in characters that can mean the many places of a flower or the place of many black birds. So two very different meanings. Now, currently in Tobiu, there is a school. It's an abandoned school. It's no longer used for children because, like I said, there's very few children. I think there's only one or two children. I'm not even sure if there are children. I have to check with Nara again. And so this abandoned school is now being used as an artist studio, and in particular is rented out by a gentleman, a sculptor by the name of Kenitas Kunamatsu, whose father used to be whose father's also an artist and also took the family to live in Tobiu many years ago. So Kenita-san went back to the school, started this cleaning project to try to revitalize this area. And in particular, behind the school, there's a massive forest. And what he's doing is actually he's calling on volunteers from the various areas around the nearby villages and the towns to help. And what he's want to do is clear up the forest, to revitalize the forest as part of the village life. And as a result of that, there's voluntary service to clean up the camp. He uses the school as a studio, but also he rents it out, or there are artists residency programs that can take place, and every single year there are these camps where he brings people together. So he's bringing art and using art as a way of revitalizing this particular period in place. I'm going to focus on very quickly on what's at the back, and you can see the wall mural. I'm going to give you a better closer view of this. So Nara was not the only artist who supported activities in Tobiu. We also had this artist, Yuzuki Azai, who is known in particular for using earth and soil, which he combines with paint to do these ginormous large-scale mural paintings, or sometimes they're done on the floor as well, but these things on the natural surfaces of a site, the site-specific artworks. And in particular, he was interested in connecting these human practice of art making with the environment. And he's interested in the power of the living environment, the power of nature itself. And what we see is this giant, fantastic beast of it looks like a mother dragon and a baby dragon that circles the wall of this particular back of the school, and they become as alive as that of the forest that surrounds the school itself. One of the things that really I was so interested in Tobiu as a way of understanding Nara is because I saw this set of drawings. This is a set of drawings by Nara, and I'm going to show it close up so you can see this. The first time Nara went to the camp in 2017, 2016, he didn't really do much. But in 2017, he started his residency and he wanted to do something. But because it's such a special site, he didn't quite know what to do. And it was only later that he started thinking, he picked up a piece of clay, he started playing with small bits of clay, and he started to pick up a charcoal that's made from the actual forest itself. And he started and went back and did these giant life-size drawings, charcoal drawings of the children that went to the camp. So there's children from different neighborhoods outside of Tokyo who came to visit during the camp, which is an annual festival. And so he started to draw these kids in life-size real drawings of real children. Again, the first time he's really done that in this particular fashion. So very unusual in Nara's practice. And by doing that, what he was doing and hanging them back in the school, he was literally bringing the students back to the school itself, to the classroom itself. So a very powerful message of another form of revitalization. Another thing that he started doing is that he became much more interested in local culture, this idea of what was happening in the surroundings next to him. Now, in this particular area, one of the Anu myths is this idea, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, it's the Ahun Rupa cave. And this is an enchanted gateway, and there are many of them scattered around Japan. And it's a cave that leads to the playground of the gods. The idea is that once you enter this cave, it takes you out to, if you're very lucky to enter this cave, you may find yourself in a magical utopian world. And so in this area, just outside of Tokyo, there is a site that is known on the coastline, which is said to be such cave. And this is a photograph of that particular cave site. And it's considered to be magical because if you can see, it's a very straight line and it's a natural straight line. So it's an unusual geological feature in that cave. And as a result of that, it's seen to be a magical cave. Nara starts taking on this myth and he goes back to his heads and he starts making smaller ceramic ones. But the ceramic cave heads, where in this version that I'm showing you, and there are multiple views, there actually are 4 different doorways, not 2, but there are 4 different doorways, each one of a face. And it's this idea that he combines his big-headed girl ceramic sculptures with that of the cave feature. And on top of these heads, what you actually see are things such as there may be bears, which is a homage to Anu god, or there could be young girls carrying giant butterbur leaves, which is a plant which is only found in Hokkaido. In other words, he's using references to local law and customs, all with this very deliberately raw quality that captures that state of transformation, which is part of the myth of the magic cave. He also did these very small palm-sized works, which is influenced by the pottery of the Jomon period. And Jomon period is a very long period. It's 14,000 to 3,000 BC of ancient Japan. Jomon period shards are among some of the oldest pottery objects in the world, and they can be found in many, many parts of Japan. So it's not just in Hokkaido, but the largest concentration is in this particular area. And he's responding once again to that history, to that ancient history of sight. And he's created these little clay figurines, and they've been scattered all around in the forest of Tokyo. Essentially, he wants to turn them almost into these little tokens of kami magic, kami being the magical forces of Shinto religion. And again, it references back to the very beginning of the series when I was talking about how Nara's family was deeply connected to Shintoism, because Nara's grandfather was a Shinto priest, and so was his father very briefly. This connection between man and nature, I think, is very, very important to some of his works at this moment in time, not least in these giant particular mist forests. And there's one now that's part of the LACMA collection. That's recently required. And what these sculptures do, whether they're large or small, they are essentially act like sleeping forest spirit. And they are supposed to evoke that gentle presence of the Jisoo sculptures, the protective spirit, and in particular, a protective spirit for children and the kami deities of Shinto world, bringing back this sort of primeval force to sacred lands. And the point that all of these sculptures tend to look alike is deliberate, because they're supposed to form this very connective network where they're spread out across the world. Effectively, what they are doing is becoming protectors of nature and witnesses to its endurance. So despite the earthquake, the nature of Japan will survive and go beyond that. It's kind of that message that he's trying to get across. When you write a book on Nara, which was what I was doing, I had so much fun. Most of this talk comes from the last couple of chapters. I had so much fun writing this because it's so many new directions in Nara's work. But I also wrote it with some sort of trepidation, because I knew that there were more things to come. And I want to end with two images that actually will talk about what may happen. I'm predicting what may happen in Nara's direction. I myself end my book with this particular work because I think it's a very interesting direction in his paintings, where we actually see Nara moving in a new direction. There's a much greater freedom here. There's a rawness which shows an artist who, at his art, has always been a very private person. And because of his privacy, he always tries to control as much as he can of the world around him. But right now, he's allowing himself to become much more vulnerable. And I think that is what's making him to be such an interesting artist at this moment in time. And in particular, for an artist whose paintings are always very finished, even when conceptually, they may not always been resolved. They're always very, very finished to the best degree and high quality. What we've seen with this particular image is that he is rather showing a work that is finished, he's shown the unfinished work, the skeletons of his process, of the imperfect painting. Again, pointing to the fact that he is again now exploring new things. And I'm going to end with this painting. And this is the more that is coming. And this work was added later in the LACMA show. I haven't seen this painting. I'm desperately keen to see it. It was completed in June 2020 and was produced during and in response to COVID-19. It's so unusual in his work, in his body of work, not least if you look at the almost glassy-like treatments of colors in the eyes itself. And we've seen how eyes are so important in this particular body of bust-like, this sort of full frontal bust portraits of girls, that they're supposed to have that monumental watchfulness. And here the watchfulness is turned into this sort of glassy gaze. Moreover, although this is a study, it is a finished painting, but that again, the idea of the unfinished patches, which adds to the state of becoming, or a present that is not quite fixed. She's almost blurry and out of focus. She's almost there, but not quite. She kind of hovers in that in-betweenness, I think is what I'm trying to say, of becoming. And as a result of that, it has a rawness, a fragility, as if she is standing in wait for the world to heal. I leave it there. Thank you very much for sharing this. I'm going to stop share and back to my screen.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Yeewan. That was so thorough and so much information. We would never have been able to fill this in a walkthrough. We've learned so much in these 3 sessions. I want to remind our audience that we'll be taking a few questions. If you have any more questions of this program, we did get one question earlier regarding when will this exhibition close, and I will say that we have not opened just yet. We're just waiting for the words from the state. We're ready for the world, and we can't wait to share this extensive, I think it's the largest body of work of Nara's practice to be featured on the West Coast, and especially with this even new piece that we did not expect before it was planned, and it just kind of came out of this moment. So we can't wait to share this. I do have a few questions from the audience. I'd love to know if Nara created any other interactive projects in addition to the children's workshop.
Yes, he did. He's actually done quite a few. So also as part of when he went back to that school, Aichi University, he was actually very engaged with the students there. And they actually had a biennale in that area. And he was actually invited to participate as one of the key artists. But rather than presenting himself and his work as a key artist, he worked with the group of students and he actually showcased the students' work. But what they did was they created a cafe. So they actually created a cafe where they put artworks up, but it was also about creating a space where people can sit down and share ideas, but share music, but also look and discuss artwork. So it was a very interactive space. He's actually done a couple of these cafe types of works where he's also shown, rather than showing his work, he's actually shown works of his own collections. But again, creating a space for others to have conversations rather than, and conversations whether with him or with other people who are in the show.
Beautiful. And regarding the, why did Nara decide to make Miss Forest so large? So this is regarding the sculpture that is in front of LACMA on Wilshire. You can actually see that one work in person today if you're
massive, right?
It's beautiful.
It's massive.
Yes.
They come in several sizes, and in some ways there's sort of there's a practical reason in terms of standardizing some of the sizes because it's a lot of work and they're very heavy things. But he wanted to create some large scale ones, partly just because he wanted a difference in scale. So there's actually medium sized ones and there's slightly smaller ones, but he kind of wants to create larger ones because he also think, they're supposed to in some ways represent trees. And there's trees in different stages of growth. That's kind of where they're coming from. So it seems fitting to have a very large one in LACMA in California, known for their very giant trees.
Wonderful, yes. And that was from Beatrice in San Diego. Could you also talk about Nara's process of choosing the colors to use in his paintings? Do you have any more background on his choices of colors?
He's very emotional when he paints. So basically he shuts the door, turns on his music, and it's whatever gets going. And he often have maybe a couple of paintings on the go. I can share one story of how he sometimes worked with colors. The color he does not like is bright pink fuchsia. And one of the things that he does is that he sometimes, if he's struggling, or at least in a couple of paintings I've seen, he's actually put a layer of fuchsia first, as if he needs to attack that. And if he can erase that fuchsia, he can then build on those colors. So that's kind of where he's going with that as well. But generally, he tends to work within certain types of colors at any one time. So there may be pastel, creamy ice cream colors, or there may be much richer velvety colors as well. So he tends to work in stages of colors, but there's no it's not like there's no logical planning to how he's doing it. It's much more emotionally driven. I always wondered whether it's to do with what kind of music he's listening. I have asked him this. He never gives me a straight answer with this one, but whether different songs will inspire different colors as well. Because as you know, as you can see from the back of your screen, he was a massive music fan.
Great. And what is Nara's vision of himself as an artist? In other words, what is the legacy that he's building, from his perspective? Has he talked about how he sees his own practice?
In terms of how he sees himself, I mean, he doesn't see himself within an art history. He's not seeing himself, where does he fit within the art history of art making? He really sees himself much more, well, what have I done? What have I given back to society in my own way? And that's where he sees his legacies. He sees a legacy within his own work. How has his work developed within his own career? And that's very important to him. And he is really pushing himself through that particular moment. So he sees his own legacy within two ways. One, I think within his own career, and one within the larger scope of what an artist should do. An artist whose practice is his practice, right? So he can only do what he can do. But doing what he can do, what can he give back to society? And I think that's where he is at this moment in time.
Excellent. And do you think Nara's direction is going in the realm of more abstract? The last piece seems to indicate more abstraction. Do you see that as a trend coming up in his practice?
I think he's always going to be borderline. I don't think he's going to go to full abstraction, but I think he's really going to use the idea of raw and unfinished as a way of expressing himself. I think that's something that he is playing around with. I think, or at least he's going to use that rawness and that unfinished state to jump off and do something very different or jump off and do other things as well. I think it's a very illuminating process in his work. It's such a dramatic shift in the way that he's painting and drawing, applying on paints, that I think it's going to trigger something. But which direction he will go, if he listens to this and he hears me say, oh, he's going to abstract, he's going to do the complete opposite, because he's a very contrary person. He's great fun, but he's very contrary.
Yeah.
I have no idea what he will do. But that's where I think he will go. That's the direction I think he's going.
Yeah, there's so many mediums he's, tackled and explored, and,
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that photography is one of those areas that he is really exploring at this moment. And I think, I mean, I went through the Sakhalin pictures very quickly, but if you were to look at the Sakhalin, which he did in 2014, and in lecture 1, I looked at his much earlier Afghanistan ones, photographs, you can see how much he's changed as a photographer. And he's got a new series of Syrian refugees that he took last year, but he's not quite ready to share those yet. And those are very powerful photographs.
Right. There's a detailed question about the tooth on the Peace Scroll and waiting for the night to come. Do you know the significance of the tooth in these details of that he's included in certain images?
And yes, he does. He likes given these little details to give their ways of differentiating the individuality of each character and each figure. So those are very important to him. Those are the things that he himself sees as very important to differentiate his child, or the pictures of the children. So they are very important, and they have tiny little details. So, and for him, we see them as tiny little details, but for him, they dramatically change the feel of a painting. So they are very important, but in his mind view, they're much more important than we as viewers may recognize them to be, because for him, they significantly change the individuality of each one of them.
Beautiful. So one of the last questions, has Nara discussed how that shift to clay and physically working with clay shifted his progression as a painter?
Oh yeah,
had that?
yeah. Yeah, very much so. I didn't show this, but it's something that he has actually done it's also in his drawings. And in some ways, this blending of different mediums. He's someone who before in the past were like, this is painting, this is drawing, this is ceramics. One of the things that we've really seen from this period in time, and in particular, you see it, and he himself had talked about it with those giant clay heads in the paintings, is how he's combining his different practice and methods of making together. And it spills over into his drawings, and his drawings into other areas as well. So now we're actually seeing much more integrated dialogue happening between his own different work, and he finds that interesting. For him, it's his discovery of himself, so that's part of that journey that he's taking. But yes, very, very much so, very important to him at this moment in time.
Wonderful. It's so exciting to follow his practice, and I just can't wait to see more of his work and your work in the field. I want to thank our audience for joining us, and especially Yeewan, thank you so much for all of this work that you've put into learning about Nara and his practice, and sharing that back with us and the world. I'm so proud to share this with such a great audience. I also want to welcome everyone to check out this series. If you miss any of the sessions on our YouTube, we'll be posting that in the near future. There's also a wonderful interview with the artist Yoshitomo Nara, as well as the curator Mika Yoshitaki. That's on our YouTube currently. So I hope you can learn more about this amazing, prolific, brilliant artist, and see his work very soon at LACMA. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.